So we will be having our second peer mentoring session for this term. So I am Nash Primo Besana, a second year BS accountancy student of Mapua MCL, and our topic for today is accounting for retained earnings and other components of shareholders' equity. So this is under corporation accounting module 2 midterms. So our agenda for today, we have a total of 8 topics. So medyo madami siya kasi ayun, medyo heavy talaga si corporation. So first, we have retained earnings. Second, we have dividends, the important dates, the types of dividends, and how to account them each. Third, we have the share split, which is divided into split up and split down. Fourth is the prior period errors. Fifth is the statement of retained earnings plus kung paano mag-appropriate. And then sixth, we have the statement of changes in shareholders' equity. Seventh is the book value per share. And eighth is the earnings per share. So first, we have retained earnings. So what do we mean by retained earnings? So first of all, it represents the component of shareholders' equity arising from the retention of assets generated from profit-directed activities of the corporation. So basically, claims siya sa lahat ng assets but not on some in particular. When we recall kasi sa sole proprietorship and sa partnership, yung mga net profit and other changes sa capital, they are closed sa owner's capital agad. Like diretsa sa capital na meron si owner. So owner's capital, tas meron ding partner's capital which is allocated, di ba? Yung net income is allocated to the partner capital accounts. But here in corporation, marami kasing owners and then pwedeng mag-iba-iba yung owners through time. So, yung net profit and other changes, they are close sa retained earnings. So, ayun nga, dun sa third bullet, income summary is close to retained earnings. And then, retained earnings is also called as accumulated profits in the IFRS since yun nga, it represents lahat ng profit and other changes that have happened throughout the time or the life of the corporation. So there are two divisions of retained earnings. Merong isa na restricted or appropriated. Ito yung hindi pwedeng i-issue as dividends kasi sinaserve siya for other purposes. And then second, ito yung unrestricted or unappropriated. Dito naman tayo pwedeng kumuha ng dividends. So kapag meron tayong ma-encounter ng mga problems na what is the ending balance of retained earnings, I suggest that we remember this T account. So first of all, we must note that the normal balance of retained earnings is credit. So lahat ng increases would be credited, lahat ng decreases would be debited. So yun nga, kung credit siya, the beginning balance would be present on the right side, the credit side, and then dun din ilalagay si net profit and then other prior period errors na i-discuss natin later. While ang magde-decrease naman sa kanya is net loss, declared dividends, kahit cash, property, or share dividends yan, magde-decrease si retained earnings. And again, other prior period errors na we will discuss later. But there might be some instances na kahit credit balance siya, normal credit balance siya, there would be a debit balance in retained earnings. That is called deficit or accumulated losses. Instead na maging positive siya sa part ng total shareholders equity, kapag debit balance si retained earnings, it is treated as a deduction kasi nga unfavorable naman na magkaroon ng negative balance sa retained earnings. Now, we move on sa second topic which is the dividend. So, ito yung medyo focus talaga ng session today since ito yung mas maraming cover sa module 2 ng corporation. So, we have three main types of dividends nga. So, cash, property, and stock dividends or share dividends. So, sa cash, we would be discussing later how to account kapag meron lang isang class of share which is ordinary and then another for two classes of share kapag meron ng preference din. Then second, we have property dividends. Pwedeng magbigay si company ng hindi cash but rather tangible assets or shares of another entity. And third, we also have stock dividends wherein instead na cash, instead na property, ang ibibigay niya sa shareholders na is shares again. So parang dadami yung shares ni shareholders kapag stock dividends yung in-issue out ni corporation. But dito sa baba, we have two uh, other types of dividends that can be considered pa rin naman as dividends. So first is scrip dividends. It is only declared kapag kulang sa cash si corporation, which later madi-discuss natin sa cash dividends na it is a requirement for a corporation na magkaroon ng cash bago siya mag-issue out ng cash dividends. So kapag for example, nag-issue out siya ng cash dividends and then hindi pala niya alam or the board of directors were unaware na kulang na pala sila sa cash, ang i-release nila is scrip dividends, which is a liability to the entitled shareholders kasi kulang ka nga ng pera, so wala ka pang maibibigay sa kanila. It is a liability. And then lastly, we have the liquidating dividends. It is declared during corporate liquidation, which is yung parang end of life pag nagko-close out na yung business. That is called corporate liquidation or by a wasting asset corporation. There are corporations din naman na allowed mag-liquidating dividends kahit hindi pa nag-e-end yung life nila kasi due to their nature na talagang nagli-liquidate sila regularly. Tulad nga ng wasting asset which is yung mga mining companies, nagde-deplete yung resources nila. So, it is parang known na sa kanila na nagli-liquidate talaga sila. And it was considered a return of capital. So, kapag nakatanggap ka ng liquidating dividends, it is technically kung na-receive mo ulit yung ininvest mo dati. So, yun yung liquidating dividends. But we will only be discussing yung first three. So, cash, property, and stock. So, shares entitled to dividends. Ano nga ba yung mga types of shares na entitled or makaka-receive talaga ng dividends? So, first of all, issued shares. So, ano na naman yan, common fact na yan na issued shares dapat may dividends. Kasi kaya ka nga nag-invest is to receive dividend income. Then second, included din dyan yung subscribed shares. But ang hindi included sa entitlement sa dividends is treasury shares dahil sa reason na sa company naman kasi yung treasury shares, nasa kanila na yun. So, hindi naman nila parang it would be illogical na paswelduhin nila yung sarili nila kapag treasury shares tas bibigyan ng dividends. Hindi siya parang walang logic behind it. And then of course, kapag unissued and unauthorized yung shares, wala din silang dividends. Now, kapag dividends kasi yung pinag-uusapan, we have three important dates to remember. First is yung date of declaration, wherein the board of directors adopts a resolution declaring that dividends are to be paid, specifying its details. So dito nila in-announce na magde-declare kami ng dividends on that certain date, how much, anong type of dividend, ganon. And this establishes the liability. So, hindi sa date of payment or date of record tayo nag-recognize ng liability, but at the moment pa lang na in-announce ni Board of Directors na merong dividend silang ibibigay, liability na agad yon. So, as you can see here, nakalagay, kapag date of declaration, we have a journal entry. We need to debit retained earnings and credit dividends payable. Debit retained earnings kasi nga, doon natin kukunin yung resources para mag-issue out ng dividends. So debit, kasi di ba kanina, normal balance na is credit. If babawasan mo siya, debit siya. And then credit dividends payable kasi liability kapag meron pang outstanding na dividends na kailangang bayaran. Next date na i-observe ng corporation is yung date of record. A list of shareholders entitled for dividends is prepared. It is called the stock register. New holders of shares beyond this date are not entitled to dividends. So, from the date of declaration to the date of record, yung mga shareholders na may hawak ng dividends, ang tawag sa shares nila is ito, yung nasa baba, which is the dividend on shares held before the date of record and they are entitled to dividends. As we all know kasi merong yung mga shares kasi na hawak ng shareholders, pwede nilang ibenta sa iba. So kapag hawak nila yung shares na yon between declaration and record, they are entitled to dividends. Pero kapag binenta na nila yon between declaration and record, hindi na sila yung entitled sa dividends, but rather yung pinagbentahan na nila. Third date we have is the date of payment. Corporation settles its liability as dividends declared are distributed to entitled shareholders. It settles the liability. So dito sa date of payment, as dun nga sa name, payment, dito na i-distribute yung dividends, whether it be cash, property, or stocks. So it is the settlement of the liability. So meron tayong journal entry, which is dapat kabaliktaran netong first one. So dapat debit yung dividends payable kasi we would be closing the liability. And then credit pala dapat, yung asset na ibibigay niyo. For cash dividends, we would credit cash. Sa property dividends, we would credit kung ano mang asset yung ibinigay. And then sa stock dividends, later, meron din siyang own credit side. So kapag ex-dividend siya, it is share this includes shares held after the date of record. They are not entitled to dividends. So for example, ako, may binilhan ako ng shares, tapos natanggap ko lang yung shares after na nung date of record. But nalaman ko dun sa pinagbilan ko na nag-issue pala sila ng dividends way back the date of record nga. So ako na may hawak ng shares, hindi ko dapat i-expect na sa akin ibibigay yung dividends kasi hindi naman na-include yung pangalan ko sa date of record. But rather, yung pinagbilhan ko, yung pangalan pa rin niya, yung nakasulat dun sa stock register list. Ako, kahit man ako yung may hawak ng share, hindi ako yung tatanggap ng dividends. So ganun siya. Kapag dividend on yung share mo, you would be entitled to dividends. But if ex-dividend na siya, hawak mo lang yung share but walang dividends. So ayun. Dividends payable is a current liability if still unpaid by balance sheet date. So ayun, it is presented as a current liability. So ayan, we have our first set of problems. So if meron willing mag-answer, so just raise your hand and turn on your microphone lang. So first, we have this problem. Straw Hat Corporation started its operations on July 1, 2023. Due to the firm's consistent growth, they reported a net income of 10 million pesos on December 31, 2023. As such, its board of directors have issued a resolution on February 1, 2024 that 10% cash dividends were to be distributed on August 1, 2024. Each driven by their own purposes, the Straw Hat shareholders bought and sold their shares until the stock register was made on March 15, 2024. So the questions, when is the date of declaration, date of record, and date of payment? So I would be waiting like 2 minutes if merong mag-want. Kapag wala, we would be answering the question. Ayun. Ayan. So I think we can move on na sa answer. So answer reveal, we have the date of declaration sa February 1. Bakit February 1? Kasi ang keyword dyan is yung issuance of resolution. So yung resolution kasi, it is the document that says na nag-declare sila ng dividends. Other key terms dyan could be the declared dividends, yun mismo, date of declaration na siya. And then when is the date of record? So March 15 siya, hindi siya August 1. Bakit March 15? Kasi nakalagay doon na doon ginawa yung stock register or yung list of shareholders na entitled sa dividends themselves. And then lastly, sa date of payment, ang key term dyan is distributed, paid, yung mga ganong kind of words. And that is August 1, 2024 kasi nakalagay cash dividends were to be distributed on August 1, 2024. So yan, it's more of concepts and theories lang yung dates, but they would be very important sa paggawa ng journal entries kasi doon talaga nakabase kung anong accounts yung i-debit and i-credit. So yan. Now we move on to the first type of dividends, which is the cash dividends. It is the pro rata distribution of cash to shareholders. It is solely declared by the board of directors. So ibig sabihin lang ng solely declared by the board of directors, there is no need to consult the remaining shareholders. Kumbaga, full decision ng board of directors na kapag gusto nilang mag-issue ng cash dividends, they don't need to conduct, parang mag-vote everyone. Basta sila sa decision na lang nila, sa discretion na lang nila kung magdi-distribute sila ng cash dividends. And from the name itself, cash dividends, ang binibigay is cash. So, as said ko kanina, there are requirements in issuing cash dividends. First, we should have a sufficient balance in retained earnings. Kasi nga dun sa divisions of retained earnings, 'di ba? There is appropriated and unappropriated. Sa unappropriated, dun kinukuha yung resources para mag-issue out ng dividends. So kapag wala yung laman, there is parang a little possibility na kayang mag-dividends ni corporation. And then second, na-mention ko rin kanina, there should be an adequate balance in cash. So kasi nga cash yung ibibigay mo, dapat meron kang resources to do so. And kapag wala kang ngang cash, ang i-issue out mo instead is scrip dividends, and that would parang entail more liability sa part ni corporation kasi parang you're entitled talaga na magbigay nga ng cash. Third, we have the formal declaration from the board of directors. So any dividends naman kailangan mo nang i-declare ni board of directors before it is said to be true. So yun yung requirements ni cash dividends. And then how do we compute the amount of share of cash dividends to be received? So kapag with par yung shares na hawak mo, most likely merong percent yan na ibibigay. So for example, 10% of the par value, 20% of the par value, 5% of the par value, parang ganun. And then kapag wala namang par value yung shares, ibibigay na lang as is. Like 500,000 total cash dividends would be distributed to 10,000 shareholders. Parang a general amount na yung ibibigay ta's paghahati-hatian na lang siya. So dito yon. So kapag the corporation only has one class of shares, which is ordinary shares, kung magkano yung in-issue na dividends, sa kanila lahat yon. Kasi hindi na naman kailangang hatiin since isang kind lang naman ng share yung recipient ng dividend. So there is no accounting problem and hindi siya masyadong complicated talaga. But yung pagiging complicated would arise kapag dalawang classes yung shares ni corporation. There is ordinary and preference shares. So paano nga ba yung step-by-step procedure kapag may cash dividends tas dalawa yung class ng shares? So first of all, pay dividends first to preference shares. Kaya nga sila preference, they are prioritized sa bayaran ng dividends. But there are still rules that underlies these steps. Kapag daw kasi merong iba't ibang types ng preference shares, we need to observe different things. If preference shares are cumulative, consider dividend in arrears and current year's dividends. So to define dividend in arrears, ito yung mga dividends na na-accumulate all throughout the previous years na hindi nabayaran. Bakit natin siya ikino-consider dito? Kasi daw cumulative si preference shares. Bale, nag-iipon ng dividend si preference shares kahit walang dinedeclare si board of directors. So, for example, 3 taon na hindi nag-issue ng dividends ang corporation. Kapag cumulative yung preference shares mo, you would expect na babayaran nila yon sometime soon, yung buong 3 taon na yon plus yung current year nga kung kailan sila nagbayad. So, kung 3 taon na hindi nagbayad tas nagbayad lang this year, a total of 4 years worth of dividends yung ibabayad nila sa preference shareholders. And then if non-cumulative naman, then we need to ignore yung mga hindi nabayaran and we would only consider yung taon lang na ngayon kasi non-cumulative, hindi raw sila nag-iipon ng dividends. And then after natin mabayaran si preference shares, kapag meron pang natira, we would allocate the excess with the following rules in mind. But we also need to observe two other classes of preference shares. So participating and non-participating. If preference shares daw ay participating, the ordinary shares will also receive dividends at the preferred dividend rate. So ano ba yung preferred dividend rate? If you can observe sa mga shareholders equity examples, meron yan nakalagay, cumulative preference shares 5%, 10,000 issued, 2,000 outstanding, yung mga ganon. So yung 5% na mention ko kanina, it is yung dividend rate ng preference shares. Yun daw yung amount na marireceive nila kapag nag-issue out ng dividends. Pero bakit dito nakalagay, ordinary shares will also receive dividends at preferred dividend rate? Preferred nga. Preferred yung rate na binigay. Bakit ibibigay sa ordinary? Well, ang reason doon is participating daw si preference shares. Bale, ibig sabihin kasi ng participating parang kasama siya sa hahatian nung excess or nung remainder. So parang meron na ding benefits yung ordinary shares doon na kapag kasi hinatian, 'di ba, parang babawas yung amount kay ordinary. So to compensate with that na lower amount, bibigyan na rin sila at the preferred dividend rate. And then, further excess is allocated to preference and ordinary based on their share capital. So, gagamit tayo later ng ratios of their share capitals to further allocate kung meron pang natira after nung uh, preference share dividends, after nung preferred dividend rate, kapag may natira pa, they would be allocated based sa ratio ng share capitals. And then if non-participating naman, mas madali. Kasi hindi daw sasali si preference share sa hatian ng excess or remainder. The excess is fully given sa ordinary shares. So lahat na yon, wala ka nang need i-compute, lahat na yon sa kanila. And it must be noted na hindi rin sila bibigyan ng preferred dividend rate, pero at least sa kanila na lahat ng natira. So to sum up, yun, we need to remember these four parang elements sa pagko-compute ng cash dividends. So first of all, ang una talagang ino-observe is kung meron bang dividend in arrears. So kapag ang preference shares nyo is cumulative and participating, there is dividend in arrears. Cumulative and non-participating, there's still dividend in arrears. Bale, ang ino-observe dyan if cumulative siya. So C and C, there should be dividend in arrears. But if non-cumulative siya, you don't need to recognize dividend in arrears for your preference shares. So yon. And then next na i-observe sa computation ng cash dividends is yung current year dividend. So lahat naman yan, dapat meron talaga si preference. Kasi siya naman talaga dati yung priority, di ba? Siya yung ibibigyan first ng cash dividends before kay ordinary. So meron talaga dapat siyang current year dividends. So any type of preference shares, they would be entitled sa current year dividends. And then next, yung kanina na sinasabi ko na dividends at preference rate sa ordinary shares, they would only be gagamitin lang tong concept na to kapag participating si preference shares. Kapag non-participating, we would ignore. Hindi natin gagamitin yung preference rate sa ordinary shares. Dito lang natin siya gagamitin sa second priority. And then kapag nga may natira, yung allocation of the excess, excess would be allocated to both ordinary and preference kapag participating lang. Pero kapag non-participating, i-enjoy na ni ordinary shareholders lahat ng excess. So I recommend na you can quite familiarize yourself with this table kasi this helped me din nung topics namin to, since medyo nakakalito nga yung allocation of dividends. So ayan, if you want to screenshot, pwede kayo screenshot. And then magsisend din naman ng PDF file yung ACADS committee later. So yun, yung journal entries niya, kapag date of declaration, we would recognize a liability. And kukuha tayo ng resources from retained earnings. So debit retained earnings and then credit cash dividends payable. For date of record, again, naggawa lang naman ng listahan. So walang journal entry. You can have a memorandum entry na created stock register list for 10,000 shareholders. Parang ganun lang. And then for the date of payment, settlement of liability, so may journal entry, debit cash dividends payable, since tapos na yung liability, and then credit cash, since nagbigay ka nga ng cash, nawalan ka ng cash, so credit cash. So we have first an example problem. So one class lang muna. So medyo madali pa siya kasi ordinary lang. So on November 1, a company's board of directors votes to declare a cash dividend of 50 pesos per share of common stock. The company has 40,000 shares authorized, 22,500 issued, with only 20,000 outstanding, and 2,000 subscribed. So how do we compute ba yung cash dividends payable kapag ganito yung situation? First of all, maraming types of shares na sinabi. But there are only, yung mentioned ko kanina, there are only a few types of shares na entitled actually sa dividends. And that is issued, yes; subscribed, yes; treasury, hindi. So yun yung i-observe muna natin. So sa outstanding shares, which is issued minus treasury, bakit ima-minus si treasury? Kasi nga hindi sila entitled sa dividends dahil dahil shares naman yon na hawak mismo ng corporation. So outstanding shares ang i-observe natin, 22,500 na issued minus yung 2,500 na treasury, which is hindi siya clearly stated dito, 'di ba? But kita naman siya na binigay naman na 20,000 daw yung outstanding. So, outstanding shares 20,000 and then again, rule din na mabibigyan si subscribe. So, subscribe shares na 2,000. So, there would be a total number of shares na 22,000. So, there would be 22,000 shares entitled to dividends. They would be multiplied by the declared cash dividend per share. Ang nakalagay kasi dito is hindi full amount yung binigay. Ang binigay lang is cash dividend per share, hindi total cash dividends. So meron daw 50 pesos per share. So bawat isang share makakatanggap ng 50 pesos. So 22,000 times 50 pesos, the total amount of cash dividends payable would be 1,100,000 pesos. So kapag ordinary, madali pa talaga siya. But kapag 2 classes na, there would be confusions na talaga. So the journal entries, debit retained earnings 1,100,000, credit cash dividends payable 1,100,000. And then kapag record, walang entry, kapag date of payment, i-close na si liability, debit cash dividends payable 1,100,000, credit cash 1,100,000. So now we move on sa 2 classes na there's ordinary and there's also preference shares. So first, OA company has the following equity composition: cumulative non-participating preference shares 5%, 7,000 outstanding, 100 pesos par value. Then ordinary shares 30,000 outstanding, 20 pesos par value. The company decided to issue cash dividends worth 500,000 pesos for both preference and ordinary shareholders. And nakalagay, the company has not issued dividends for 2 years. How much will the preference shareholders and ordinary shareholders each receive? So, himay-himayin muna natin yung problem. So first, ang nakalagay na type ng preference shares, cumulative. So diyan pa lang dapat mag-click na agad na there would be dividend in arrears later on. Kasi nga, another hint na binigay is ito, the company has not issued dividends for 2 years. So yung cumulative na word plus itong ganitong statement, parang it should be a hint na for us that there would be dividend in arrears later on sa computation natin. And then yung example ay yung type ng share daw is non-participating. So later on, we need to remember na lahat ng dividends rather na matitira is sa ordinary shares na. Bale bayaran si preference kapag may natira, lahat na yon kay ordinary. So yun yung types ng preference shares. And then 5% daw, this is the dividend rate. But since non-participating siya, gagamitin lang natin yung dividend rate sa preference shares lang. Kapag participating, gagamitin sa dalawa, sa preference and ordinary. Kapag non-participating, kay preference lang. So to compute, step 1, we need to compute for the share capital amounts. Why? Kasi nga, gagamitin natin yung total amounts nila sa pagko-compute ng current year dividends, sa allocation and such. So, unahin talaga muna natin i-establish yung shareholders composition. So, how did we arrive with 700,000? So, simple lang naman, 7,000 outstanding shares times 100 pesos par value, 700,000. Then for ordinary, 30,000 outstanding shares times 20 pesos, 600,000, which gives us total share capital na 1.3 million. So next step, based dun sa table natin kanina, dividend in arrears yung susunod naman nating i-compute. So how do we compute for dividend in arrears? First, we must need to compute for the dividends per year. Kasi hindi naman natin maiipon yan all throughout the period na hindi sila nag-issue kung hindi natin i-compute yung annual dividend issuance. So first, para makuha si dividend per year, we would get the preference share capital na kinompute natin kanina, which is yung 700,000. I-multiply natin siya sa dividend rate na 5%. So 700,000 times 5%, magkakaroon daw si preference shareholders ng 35,000 pesos every year. Pero nga, as stated dito kanina sa problem natin, the company has not issued dividends for 2 years. 2 taon na silang hindi nababayaran. And since cumulative siya, mag-iipon talaga sila ng parang liability kumbaga sa preference shareholders nila. So yung 35,000 per year, i-multiply siya sa number of years na hindi nag-issue ng dividends, which is 2, 35,000 times 2, there is 70,000 pesos dividend in arrears. So later on, gagamitin natin siya sa first part ng computation or ng allocation ng dividends. Ayan. So after mo ma-compute yung dividend in arrears, you can allocate the total amount of issued dividends, which is yung given na 500,000 pesos. So dun sa table, una talaga si dividend in arrears, 70,000 for preference. And then don't forget na hindi lang naman yung previous years yung kinonsider kay preference. May utang din si corporation for this year. So dapat mo ring i-consider yung current year dividend na 35,000. Saan siya nakuha? Dito lang din sa dividend per year na 35,000. Hindi na siya ginalaw kasi nga isang taon lang naman si current year. So 35,000 na siya as is. So 70,000 na dividend in arrears, current year's dividends na 35,000 would already give you parang a subtotal of 105,000. But hindi pa naman doon nagtatapos yung computation natin since yun nga 105,000 pa lang yung na-allocate. Ang total daw is 500,000. So anong gagawin sa natirang 395? So based nga dun sa type ng preference shares, dun tayo magbabase. Ang nakalagay here, non-participating. So ang rule nga kapag non-participating, lahat ng excess kay ordinary. So yung 395 na yun, lahat na yun ibibigay kay ordinary. And then sa remainder, walang matatanggap si preference kasi nga hindi raw siya sasali, non-participating. So naka-NP yan, so basically zero lang yan. So if we kapag tinotal na natin lahat, 70,000 na arrears plus 35 na current, preference shareholders would receive a total of 105,000 pesos, while sa ordinary, they would receive a total of 395,000 pesos. And then kapag in-add mo yung dalawa, it would total naman sa 500,000. So, correct naman siya. Walang sobra, walang kulang. First to receive dividends nga are preference shares. So, una nyo talagang i-compute arrears at current year ng preference. And then since nga non-participating, all of the remainder would go to ordinary. So I recommend compute nyo muna itong first part na to, yung dividend in arrears and current, plus kunin nyo yung subtotal para makuha nyo kung ilan na lang yung natira. And then after nyo makuha yung natira, dun na kayo mag-compute ng allocation of remainder depende kung participating or non-participating. So yan, we have our next set of problems with JPN points. So again, if you want to answer, simply raise your hand. And if pag natawag, you can turn on your microphones naman. So for this problem, the Tortured Poets Corporation declared cash dividends of 2.50 pesos per share on its ordinary shares. The company has 20,000 shares authorized, 9,000 shares issued, and 1,500 shares were taken in treasury. What is the journal entry to record the dividend declaration? So to give you a hint, one class of share lang siya. So it would be quite easy, walang allocation. So ayun, I would be giving you guys some time to compute them if you want to answer. Ayan, so are there anyone who would want to try this question? I think wala naman. So let us move on na sa pag-reveal ng answers natin. So debit retained earnings 18,750, credit cash dividends payable 18,750. So how did we arrive dun sa journal entry na yon? So first, we need to remove treasury shares kasi nga hindi daw siya entitled sa dividends. So yung issued kanina na 9,000 minus 1,500 na treasury would give us outstanding shares na 7,500. And then per share daw, binigyan ng 2.50 pesos. So 7,500 times 2.50, magkakaroon tayo ng payable na 18,750. So ayun yung answer natin. So next problem, a company has 200,000 pesos of 10% non-cumulative participating preference shares and 400,000 pesos of ordinary shares outstanding. No dividends were paid last year, but 150,000 pesos were declared as cash dividends this year. How much will ordinary shareholders receive daw? So I will give you again some time for yourselves if you want to compute on your own. And then later natin i-answer reveal. Ayan, so let us reveal our answers for this problem. Ayan, so 100,000 pesos yung mabibigay kay ordinary share. So paano ba natin mako-compute yung 100,000 pesos? So first of all, yun nga yung sa table earlier, dividend in arrears una. But meron bang dividend in arrears? So walang dividend in arrears kasi nga non-cumulative si preference shares. Walang arrears. So 0, 0, walang dividend in arrears. Second, we would compute yung current year's dividends. Now, sinong makakatanggap ng current year's dividends? It depends sa second type, yung participating, non-participating. Kapag participating, preference lang. Kapag participating dalawa, preference and ordinary. Kapag non-participating, si preference lang. And makakompute yung current year's dividends using the dividend rate. So in this case, participating, 10% for both preference and ordinary. So yung 200,000 ni preference times 10%, they would receive 20,000. And then for ordinary na 400,000 times 10%, they would receive 40,000. So yon. As said ko kanina, kapag meron ka ng dividend in arrears tsaka current year's dividends, stop ka muna. Kunin mo muna yung subtotal nila. So 60,000 pesos. Kukunin natin yung subtotal again para makuha naman kung ilan na lang yung natira or may natira pa ba. So kapag may natira pa, we would move on nga sa allocation of the remainder. So since 60,000 lang yung nabigay dito sa first two parts, and there is a total daw of 150,000, meron pa tayong excess na 90,000. And how do we allocate this? Pupunta ulit tayo sa type ng preference shares na pinakita. So, participating daw. So, sasali daw si preference shares sa hatian ng remainder. So, paano ba hahatiin yung remainder kung dalawa yung kasali? So, yung 90,000, i-multiply natin sa ratio ng share capitals nila. So meron daw tayong 200,000 na preference, 400,000 na ordinary. So ang total nun is 600,000. So yung preference divided by total, yun yung ratio niya. And then ordinary divided by total, yun yung ratio niya. So 200 divided by 600, 2/6. And then 400 divided by 600, 4/6. Yung ratios na yun yung i-multiply natin sa remainder. So 90,000 times 2/6, 30,000. 90,000 times 4, 60,000. So yun yung pag-allocate ng remainder kapag participating. Kunin mo na yung ratios i-multiply sa remainder, and then yun na yung yung hatian ng excess. And then we would get all of the amounts that we have computed earlier. The total natin sila. So for preference, ang total would be 20 plus 30, 50,000. For ordinary, 40 plus 60, 100,000. So kapag inad mo yan, 150,000, walang sobra, walang kulang. But ang question, how much will ordinary shareholders receive? So ang answer lang natin is 100,000 pesos. So that would be it for the cash dividends. Let us now move on to the second type of dividends, na property dividends. So, ang definition lang naman niya, it is non-cash distributions to shareholders. Kung kanina pera yung binibigay natin, dito, it could be, yun nga, dito sa kinds, it could be tangible assets such as property, plant and equipment, or machines, di ba? And pwede rin namang units of inventories. So kapag binigyan ka, for example, ng product as dividends, that is also considered as property dividends. And then second, pwede ring ibigay, for example, si corporation, meron siyang investment in another entity. Yung shares niya sa another entity, pwede niyang ibigay sa sarili niyang shareholders as dividends. And that is considered as property dividends. Take note na kahit share yung binigay, hindi siya tinatawag na share dividends kasi hindi mo naman shares yung binigay mo. Shares ng ibang company yung binigay ng corporation. So, in that sense, it is considered as a property of your company. So, property dividends kapag nagbigay ka ng shares of another entity. So, how do we measure property dividends? So, isa lang naman yung rule dyan. Always siya at fair value of the asset to be distributed. Whether tangible asset or shares of another entity, fair value palagi yung gagamitin. So the journal entries, date of declaration, again, magre-recognize ng liability, debit retained earnings, credit property dividends payable. Date of record, gagawa lang ng list, walang mangyayari. So no journal entry. And then date of payment, matatanggal na si liability, debit property dividends payable, credit, asset given up. So depende ngayon sa kung anong asset yung dinistribute sa property dividends. So we would give an example naman. So Happy Hearts Incorporated has a total of 50,000 ordinary shares outstanding. It issued property dividends in which in every 5 shares, a shareholder will receive 1 unit of inventory. The inventory costs 20 pesos and is sold at 50 pesos. The market value of a Happy Hearts share is 100 pesos and the market value of its inventory is 60 pesos per unit. So medyo ano siya, it's a mouthful and marami ding numbers. So himay-himayin natin. So yung mga naka-red, that would mean they are important details. So yung Happy Hearts daw, meron siyang total of 50,000 ordinary shares outstanding. Pero bakit siya important? Kasi ang nakalagay sa rule ng property dividends nila, for every 5 shares, it would be equivalent to 1 unit of inventory. So dito yun mapupunta sa computation, we would reflect dito. So outstanding shares na 50,000 divided by yung ratio ng share to inventory. So kung meron ka daw 5 share, makakatanggap ka ng isang unit ng produkto nila. So that would be divide. So 50,000 shares divided by 5 na binigay dito as ratio, total units of inventory to be distributed is 10,000 pesos. Now, how do we compute for the total property dividends payable? Should we use cost of 20 pesos, cost of inventory of 20 pesos, market value of share na 100, or market value of inventory na 60? So based sa rule, dito, property dividends are measured at fair value of the asset to be distributed. So dito pa lang cross out na si cost kasi hindi siya fair value. Now, dalawa na lang yung fair value na natira. Fair value ng share, fair value ng inventory. Pero ano ba yung dinistribute? Inventory. So we would use yung 60 pesos. So 10,000 na inventory kanina times 60 pesos na fair value, the property dividends payable would be 600,000 pesos. So the journal entries, Debit retained earnings, since dun ka kumuha ng resources, 600,000. Credit property dividends payable, 600,000. Date of record, no entry. Date of payment, settlement of liability, debit property dividends payable at 600,000. But dito tayo magkakaroon ng kaibahan sa cash dividends. Meron kasing pwedeng mag-recognize ng gain or loss kapag property dividends yung gini-give out natin. So, nagbigay tayo ng inventory. So, parang expect na natin na i-credit natin si inventory at some point in this issuance of the dividends. So, credit inventory, but at what amount? Yun yung tanong. Should it be at fair value na nakalagay dito kanina na measurement of property dividends? The answer is no. Kasi ang carrying amount ng inventory is always at cost. And binibigay mo naman siya, parang tinatanggal mo siya sa records mo at cost. So inventory, close out inventory at cost. So 20 pesos na cost times yung 10,000 na i-distribute, we have 200,000 pesos. Pero hindi siya balance. 600,000 daw yung liability na kinlose mo, tas 200,000 lang yung inventory na kinlose mo. So to balance it all out, we would recognize a gain on distribution of property dividends na 400,000 pesos. So yun yung journal entry ng property dividends. Dito lang naman talaga yan medyo magiging confusing, pati sa paggamit ng fair value. So kapag dividends payable, use fair value. But kapag i-close mo na yung carrying amount, parang ibabawas mo na siya sa books at the main account of inventory itself at cost siya. Next, kapag naman shares yung binigay, this is an example situation. Single company has 20,000 shares of taken company costing 10 pesos each. On its own, it has 5,000 ordinary shares outstanding. Single's board of directors declared property dividends in which holding 2 single stocks will entitle a shareholder to 1 taken stock. The fair value of a single stock is 5 pesos each, while the fair value of a taken stock is 12 pesos each. So, himay-himayin ulit natin. On its own daw, si single company, it has 5,000 ordinary shares outstanding. And then, ang rule ng property dividends niya, holding 2 single stocks. So, every dalawa daw na stocks nila, bibigyan nila yung shareholder ng isang taken stock. So, dalawang single stock would be equal to 1 taken stock. Yun yung ratio ng property dividends. And then we have fair value of single stock at 5, fair value of taken stock at 12. So, let us now compute. Yung outstanding shares, 5,000. And then for every 2 shares nga daw, magkakaroon ng 1 taken stock. So 5,000 divided by 2, total taken shares to be distributed, 2,500. Multiplied by what amount? So there are 2 fair values na binigay dito. Fair value ng single, tsaka fair value ng taken. Now, we need to observe muna, ano ba yung ibibigay ni single company sa shareholders niya. Nakalagay, entitle a shareholder to 1 taken stock. So, ang asset to be distributed is taken. So, ang gagamitin nating fair value is yung fair value ni taken, which is 12. 25 times 12, and that would yield us an amount of 30,000 pesos for our property dividends payable. So, to record, date of declaration, debit retained earnings, 30,000, credit property dividends payable, 30,000. Date of record, walang entry again. And then sa date of payment, dito nga, pwede tayong mag-recognize ng gain or loss. So first muna, close out yung liability earlier na 30,000. And then, this is an asset account, investment in shares. So hindi kasi nila, as mentioned nga, hindi shares nila yung binigay nila sa shareholders. Si single company, ang ibibigay niya sa shareholders niya is taken company shares. So ang account na babawasan natin is investment in shares. And similar dun sa inventory, ang nakalagay naman sa books is cost, hindi naman fair value. So kapag babawasan mo yung books mo, at cost din mo siya babawasan. So yung shares kanina na 2.5 times yung cost nila na 10 pesos, 2.5 times 10 pesos, 25,000. But since merong pang discrepancy between 30 and 25, we can recognize gain on distribution of property dividends at 5,000 pesos. So ganun lang yung property dividends. So now we have another set of problems for JPN points. So for our first question, again, if you want to answer, you may raise your hand after the time and then turn on na lang yung microphone. So first question, a company issued machinery, 10,000 units of inventory, and 5,000 shares of another entity as property dividend. So sobrang yaman nila, nagbigay sila ng machinery, nagbigay sila ng inventory, nagbigay pa sila ng shares as property dividends lang, whose details are as follows. Cost of machinery, 1.5 million. Fair value of machinery, 2 million. Cost of inventory, 50 pesos per unit. Fair value of inventory, 25 pesos per unit. And then sa shares of another entity, hindi ng kanila, cost is 200 pesos per share, fair value is 210 per share. The question is, how much will be deducted to retained earnings upon the declaration of dividends? So I would give you mga 5 minutes to compute on your own. And then if merong mag-answer, let us hear your thoughts. If wala naman, we can answer reveal na din after 5 minutes. Ayan, so may nakita ako sa chat box. Wait lang, let me check. Ayan, so 2,000,000 plus 250 plus 1,050,000. So ang answer ni Roger is 3,300,000. So let us check. So either way naman, you already have 10 JPN points for participating. So yan, tama naman, 3,300,000 pesos. So again, paano siya
Yay.
na-compute? Paano siya na-compute? Fair value of machinery na 2 million plus total fair value of inventory na 10,000 times 25, 250,000. Then total fair value ng shares na 5,000 times 210, 1,050,000 for a total of 3,300,000. So, wait lang. Wait ko lang. Okay. Next naman, may question pa ba? Ayan, next na pala. So let us now move on sa next type of dividends natin, which is yung share dividends. Ito yung third and last type ng dividends na i-discuss. So to define, it is the pro-rata distribution of corporations' own shares. So kung kanina, shares of another entity, ito ang i-distribute nila is own shares. It decreases retained earnings and increases share capital. There is no effect on total shareholders' equity. The amount on retained earnings is merely transferred. So ano bang ibig sabihin nun? Since yung dividends nga is kinukuha out of retained earnings, mababawasan sa retained earnings. But in this case, shares yung ibibigay. So kumbaga, it's considered as another issuance of shares. Mag-i-increase si share capital. So yung amount from retained earnings, malilipat lang siya sa share capital. Kaya masasabi natin na no effect on total shareholders' equity. Bale, nagkaroon lang talaga ng lipatan ng amounts na yung amount dati na nasa retained earnings, ginawa na siyang totoong shares and it is now considered as share capital. So there are two types of share dividends. First is yung small share kapag less than 20% yung in-issue, and then large share 20% or more than 20%, which later naman makikita natin yan. And then yung measurement, different from property dividends, dalawa yung rule niya. So kapag daw small share at fair value, pero kapag large share at par. So kapag nag-issue ng share dividends na less than 20%, always take note, fair value ang gagamitin. But if more than 20% or 20% itself, par value ng shares na in-issue yung gagamitin. So journal entries, medyo iba siya dun sa mga nauna natin na dividends sa cash and property. Kasi meron siyang own account actually na shares distributable. Hindi siya share dividends payable. Ang account niya is shares distributable. So debit retained earnings, since yun nga, babawasan pa rin naman natin si retained earnings. And then credit shares distributable. And then credit share premium if at fair value. Kasi di ba there are times naman na mas mataas si fair value kaysa sa par value. So yung difference nun, it would be recognized as share premium. And then for the date of record, there is no journal entry. Same pa rin naman for all three dividends. And then upon issuance, so for example, na-distribute na siya and yung retained earnings, naging totoong shares na siya. So we would debit shares distributable and then credit na yung ordinary shares or share capital ordinary, whichever man yung ginagamit nyo. And then note, shares distributable is shown in the shareholders' equity section as an addition to ordinary share capital if to be presented between declaration and distribution dates. So kung yung kanina, yung cash dividends payable tsaka property dividends payable, they are current liabilities, di ba? But yung shares distributable daw, kapag kailangan na talaga silang ilagay sa balance sheet, it is presented as an addition to ordinary share capital. It is a capital account or an equity account. Hindi siya liability. So nakalagay siya sa shareholders equity, hindi sa liability section. So example problem. Takoyaki Corporation issued 15% share dividends on its 50,000 outstanding ordinary shares with 50 pesos par value. The fair market value of its shares is 70 pesos. So how do we compute? Mali yan. Dapat computation of shares distributable. So outstanding shares na 50,000 multiplied by the share dividend rate, 15%. So wala pang issue doon, whether small or large, palagi lang siyang ganon. Outstanding times 15%. So, ayun, 50,000 times 15%, 7.5 yung bagong shares na may issue out. Multiplied by, dito na magtatalo kung small or large. So, how do we determine ba if small or large? Kapag small, less than 20%. kapag large, 20% or more than 20%. So since 15 lang 'to, it is considered a small share. So kapag small share, ang gagamitin again, fair value. So 7.5 na bagong shares times fair value na 70, ayun, fair value na 70, 7.5 times 70, ang shares distributable would be 525,000. But what if naman binago yung percentage, ginawang 30%, it would now be a large share. So same given pero 30% na daw yung in-issue. So 50,000 times 30% na share dividend rate, ang bagong shares na is 15,000. And then since 30% mas mataas sa 20% large share, ang gagamitin na is par value instead na fair value. So 15,000 times 50 pesos, ang shares distributable kapag large share is 750,000. So yun lang yung difference niya. Kapag small, fair market value. Kapag large share, par value. So yan, another set of problems. Ilan ba? Parang isa to, isa. Yan, nonchalant company has 100,000 outstanding ordinary shares by the start of 2023. If it declared a 20% share dividend at the end of 2023 and subsequently declared a 50% share dividend in the middle of 2024, how many are its shares after considering all share dividends? So, ang tinatanong dito is not kung magkano yung shares distributable, but rather ilan na yung total shares niya after niya mag-issue ng dalawang share dividends. So, ayun, I would give you again 5 minutes. So, we would come back at 10:42. Bye. Ayan, I think meron na kayong answer. So, let us try another person naman, si Abigail. So, what is your answer?
50,000.
50,000. And then si Roger, nakalagay sa chat. Wait lang. Ano nga yun? 180 ba yung, parang 180 yung sagot niya.
Yes.
So let us check if how many are its shares after considering all share dividends. So the answer is 180,000 shares. So no worries naman, we would award pa rin JPN points to the both of you. So outstanding shares 2023. So yun yung 100,000 niya kanina. Meron daw siyang 100,000 noong 2023 times, kaso kasi nag-declare siya ng 20% share dividend. So times 1.2. Bakit 1.2 instead na 0.2 lang? That kasi, ang kino-compute na natin is total shares, including yung dinagdag pati yung luma. Hindi lang natin kino-compute kung ilan yung nadagdag, but rather the total, the new total. So 100,000 times 1.2, 100% tsaka 20%, that would give us 120,000 shares by 2024. Pero nag-issue daw siya ulit ng share dividend na 50%. So similar technique lang, times 1.5 para diretso na tayo sa total, hindi lang yung bago. So 120 times 1.5, we would arrive at 180,000 total number of shares. So ayun, thank you very much for your answers. So let us now move on sa next set of topics, which is yung share split. So tapos na tayo sa dividends, let us define now share split. Share split is the distribution of additional shares to stockholders while retaining the total amount of share capital of the corporation. So yung kanina, 'di ba, sa share dividends, binawasan si retained earnings para dagdagan si share capital. Dito naman, nag-distribute ng additional shares pero wala daw pagbabago sa total amount. So how could that be possible? So later on, i-discuss natin yung effects niya. I mean yung totoong parang sa computational na. So yun nga, it would change the number of shares, but there would also be a proportionate opposite change in par value. And as said nga, there is no total effect on the shareholders' equity. Kasi nga, na-retain daw yung total amount. So, yung effects na to, they would vary depending sa type ng share split na ginawa. So, there are two types, split up at split down. Kapag split up, the number of shares would be increased. Pero, there would also be a correlated decrease in the par value. So, kung gaano kalaki yung in-increase ni shares, ganun din dapat kalaki yung ibababa sa par value. Kapag naman split down, bababa daw si shares, pero tataas din si par value. And again, dapat proportionate yung pagtaas at pagbaba nila at their own rates kasi dapat there is no effect pa rin daw sa total shareholders equity. So example, Esophagus Incorporated has 10,000 issued shares with 200 pesos par value, having a total of 2 million pesos as its share capital. Then it announced a share split. So these are two different situations. So kung split up daw na 5-4-1, so it means na for every 1 share gagawin daw siyang 5, 5-4-1. Yun yung ibig sabihin niya. So for every 1 share, there would be 5 shares. So 10,000 issued shares times 5, magkakaroon na siya ng 50,000 shares. But since kailangan nga natin na there is no total effect on shareholders' equity, kung tinaas natin si number of shares, dapat ibababa naman natin si par value at the same rate. So kung times 5 natin si shares, dapat i-divided by 5 natin si par value. 200 par value divided by 5, 40 pesos. So if we compute, yung 10,000 times 200, yung share capital is 2 million. But still here, 50,000 times 40 na par value, it's still 2 million. Tumaas yung shares, but there is no effect on the total shareholders' equity. Yun yung essence ni split up. So, bakit ba gumagawa ng parang share splits? So kapag kasi mas marami yung shares, 'di ba, parang mas madali siyang ipakalat sa mga potential shareholders. Kapag mas maraming shares, tas mas mababa pa yung par, it would be easier for them to market their shares, mas marami mag-i-invest, and mas madali silang makakaipon nung desired share capital nila. And then for split down naman, baliktad siya, 1-4-5. For every 5 shares, gagawin na lang daw siyang isa. So yung 5 shares, i-merge into 1. So 10,000 shares divided by 5, 2,000 shares. And then kung dinivide mo to dito, dapat times naman si par value. Mag-i-increase si par. 200 par value times 5 would give us 1,000 pesos par value. So again, to check kung correct yung share split natin, i-compare lang yung share capital. 10,000 times 200, that's 2 million. And then 2,000 times 1,000, that's still 2 million. So nag-decrease si shares, but 2 million pa rin yung share capital. That is share split. So split up, tataas si shares, bababa si par value. Split down, bababa si shares, tataas si par value. And then to check, compute nyo lang again yung share capital to ensure na walang nagbago. And then another set of problems regarding share split. One Spark Corporation has 200,000 shares authorized and 100,000 shares issued, with 40,000 of it in treasury. At the beginning of the year 2023, One Spark declared a split up wherein every share would now be equivalent to 3 shares. The par value of its shares before the share split was 20 pesos. How much is the share split's total effect in shareholders' equity? So for 5 JPN points, siguro I would give you 3 minutes. So if meron na kayong answer, you can raise your hand or chat sa chat box. And if wala, we would reveal the answer in 3 minutes. Yes, ayun. To clarify lang pala, you can also private message me since walang chat sa Teams. So kapag want yung send ng answers sa Teams kayo mag-private message or pwede din naman raise hand since pwede din naman on ng mic. Thank you. Ayan, so it's already 10:48. Ayan, nag-message sa akin si Roger, 300,000 shares with 6.66 value per share. Yun yung answer niya. How about Abigail? Do you have an answer ba or should we continue with the answer reveal? I think wala naman. So let us reveal the answer na. So the answer is 0. Kasi yung sinabi nga kanina, share splits may increase or decrease the number of shares and their par value respectively, but it will never change the total amount of shareholders' equity. So ang question kasi here is how much is the share splits total effect in shareholders' equity? So kapag tinanong na magkano yung binago sa shareholders' equity sa share split, the answer is always 0. But to consider na rin yung sagot ni Roger, let us try to compute nga the new par value. So we have 100,000 shares issued with 40,000 of it in treasury. So kapag kasi share split, hindi siya katulad ng dividends na tinatanggal si treasury. So kapag share split, nasi-split din si treasury shares. So we have 100,000 na lahat-lahat na shares na isi-split. So 100,000 times 3, that would be 300,000 shares. And then, yung par value na 20 pesos, we would divide it by 3, which is 6.66. So, tama yung sagot ni Roger if the question was how many would be the shares and how much would be the par value. But the question is, how much is the share split's total effect? So, kapag total effect tas share split, the answer is most likely 0. But ayun, thank you pa rin Roger since your answer and your direction pa rin naman is correct. So that would be 5 JPN points. So next, problem 7. Pet Peeve Incorporated had the following share and dividend related transactions for the year. So combination siya ng mga discussions natin earlier with dividends and share split. So declared 25% share dividends on June, issued 30,000 new ordinary shares on September, and announced a 4-for-1 split up on November. If PetPeeve Incorporated had 70,000 issued shares at the beginning of the year, how many shares does it have now at the end of the year? So 70,000 daw yung una, tas nag-share dividends, nag-issue ng bago, at nag-split up. And then how much na daw yung current shares niya after nung tatlong transactions na yon. So since this is for 10 JPN points, I would give you guys 5 minutes to answer. Then if meron na, you can chat again or raise your hand. 10:56 tayo balik.
Or 70, okay?
Ayan, so may answer na daw si Roger na 470,000. So how about the others? Si Abby, do you have an answer na ba or we can answer reveal na? Ayan, so let us proceed. So the correct answer is 470,000 shares. So issued shares na beginning, which is yung 70,000, multiplied by the June share dividends, which is yung technique earlier, na times 1.25 na agad instead na 0.25 lang. So 70,000 times 1.25 would give us 87,500. And then nag-issue daw ng panibagong 30,000 on September. 87.5 plus 30 would give us 117,500. And then lastly, nag-split up pa. So 117,500 times 4 would give us, itong 4 from the split up, 470,000 shares. So ayun yung ating share split problems. Now let us move on to our next topic, fifth na ata to, if I remember correctly, prior period errors. So prior period errors, these are omissions and misstatements of financial statements from one or more prior periods, only discovered in the current period. So there are times kasi that there are accounting mistakes during the prior periods or yung mga past years, past documents, past records, and then ngayon lang siya na-discover in the current time. So when such mistakes are uncovered, they are called prior period errors and pwede pa rin naman sila i-correct. So, correction of prior period errors will have the following effects. There would be a movement in the retained earnings. So instead na parang debit expense, credit income, idediretso na natin siya sa retained earnings, yung movement na or yung correction of the prior period error. It is reported in the current period statement of retained earnings. So kahit na it is an element of past years, kapag this time mo lang kinorek, ang reporting period nun is the current period. And then later on, we would discuss what is the statement of retained earnings since hindi naman siya typically na mention kapag when we say financial statements. So this is a unique type of financial statement na hindi naman required but it is still helpful for us to know what does it look like and how to prepare it. And then lastly, it is disclosed in a footnote in the financial statement. So of course, we need to disclose na itong error pala na to is committed pa in 2018 or 2019 and na-correct lang siya now. So it moved retained earnings but it is a prior period error. So yun yung mga parang proper disclosures for the such an event kapag merong na-uncover na prior period error. So ang journal entries niya, basically ito yung mga parang correcting entries lang din sa basic accounting na overstatement, understatement, but ang gumagalaw is retained earnings, pati yung account na in-adjust. So kapag overstated yung asset, kailangan natin siyang bawasan. So yung asset would be credited. And to balance it out, yung kasama niya sa journal entry is debit retained earnings. Then on the other hand, kapag understated si asset, kailangan natin siyang dagdagan, i-debit natin si asset, and then credit retained earnings. So kapag debit retained earnings, it is technically parang we're recording a loss or we're recording an expense kasi nga overstated, kailangan mong bawasan. That can be considered as a loss or an expense. Kapag understated naman, we would increase retained earnings kasi dati mababa lang siya, tas ngayon pala it turns out mataas siya. So we can it is similar to recognizing income or revenue or gain. So increase retained earnings. But if ang liability or capital naman yung overstated, kapag liability account or capital account yung sobra, baliktad siya. So kapag liability kasi and capital, di ba, ang normal balance niya is credit. But if overstated, kailangan siyang bawasan, we would debit the account adjusted and then credit retained earnings. Kapag naman understated siya, kailangan natin siyang dagdagan and credit balance siya, we would credit the account adjusted and debit retained earnings. So yan. So medyo kaya naman talaga yung prior period errors since correcting entries lang yung need but ang kaibahan lang from the usual basic correcting entries, retained earnings yung gagamitin. So for our problems for the prior period errors, here we have problem number 8. 2 years ago, an accountant has incorrectly charged insurance expense of 150,000 pesos into the inventories account. What is the journal entry to correct this prior period error? So again, si accountant daw chinarge niya sa insurance expense yung 150,000 when dapat palang ilagay yung 150 sa inventories. So how do we correct this prior period error with a journal entry? So I would give you guys again 5 minutes. 11:04. Ay sorry, parang mali ata yung explanation ko earlier. An accountant has incorrectly charged insurance expense of 150,000 into the inventories account. Bale, ang mali pala niyang dinagdagan is inventories. Kasi dapat daw insurance expense yung 150, pero ni-record niya as inventory. So, how do we correct this error?
Debit retained earnings.
Ayan, so may answer daw si Roger from his chat. So, ayun. Debit account adjusted, credit retained earnings, or you would, baliktad yung answer mo.
Baliktad.
Okay, okay. Pero, let us answer reveal. Tama naman yung initial answer mo na debit yung inventories, credit retained earnings. Why? Yes, yes, tama siya kasi nakalagay here na chinarge daw sa inventories account. When we say kasi charged, binawasan siya. So kapag binawasan, it is considered as understated. So kapag understated si asset, nabawasan si inventories kahit dapat naman talagang hindi siya bawasan, we would debit inventories 150,000 and then credit retained earnings 150,000. So ayun, I hope na gets. Again, na-charge kasi si inventories. Nabawasan siya ng di oras. So understated siya. So kailangan siyang ibalik. Kailangan siyang dagdagan ulit to yun, para mas tama na yung statement niya. So debit inventories 150, credit retained earnings 150. Ayan, so inventories were incorrectly decreased by 150. To correct it, increase it by 150. The account title insurance expense, ito to. Yung insurance expense shall no longer appear in this entry as it is a nominal account from a prior period. So kung sa basic accounting tapos merong current period error, tas current period mo rin siya nalaman, the entry would be, di ba, the retained earnings would be credit insurance expense. But since prior period nga siya, and yung insurance expense na account is just a temporary account, idiretso na lang natin sa retained earnings yung adjustment. So, hindi na siya lalabas sa entry na yan. So, ayun naman yung prior period errors. So, yan. Next, we have the statement of retained earnings. So, ito yung sinasabi ko kanina. It is not a required financial statement, but it is important to show the composition of retained earnings. So, yung kanina na-mention ko dun sa very first few slides natin, divisions of retained earnings, there are two. Yung restricted or appropriated, tsaka yung unrestricted and unappropriated. So kapag restricted, it cannot be issued as dividends. So restricted, it might be pwedeng gamitin as expansion fund o kaya investment fund. Basta hindi daw siya pwedeng galawin aside from the specific purposes na nakalagay doon. So, in other words, hindi siya pwedeng gamitin as dividends. Kapag naman unrestricted or in other words, free, tsaka unappropriated, dito tayo kumukuha ng dividends na pang cash, property, and share dividends. But if we find the need to appropriate retained earnings, what would be the journal entry? So appropriating retained earnings again is, for example, meron kang retained earnings na walang purpose. Tapos naisipan ng corporation na, gagamitin ko na lang 'to in the future to, para magpatayo ng bagong building, magpatayo ng bagong branch. So that can be considered as appropriation. You set it aside for a different purpose. So appropriation journal entry, debit retained earnings, since mababawasan yung normal mong retained earnings, yung unappropriated, and then credit appropriated retained earnings. So these are two separate accounts. Kapag retained earnings, it can be parang implicit na agad na unrestricted siya. Pero pwede din naman yan unappropriated retained earnings, but more ano kasi na parang mas common na ginagamit retained earnings as it is. And then credit appropriated retained earnings. So this is the format for statement of retained earnings. Nawala ba yung slide? Ayan, yan. Okay na. So, appropriated retained earnings muna yung first section ng statement of retained earnings. So, beginning, as always, yun yung nasa taas. And then you would add appropriation. So, if merong nadagdag if merong mga fund na sinet aside for a specific purpose, that is the appropriations that you would add here. And then, hindi lang siya na-mention dito, pero kapag, for example, yung mga fund na yun, nagbago yung isip ng corporation na, hindi na lang pala namin itutuloy yung specific purpose, yung purpose na yun, ibabalik namin siya sa unappropriated. So, you would deduct it from this section. And then, after those transactions, you would arrive at appropriated retained earnings ending. And then, for unappropriated naman, same lang din, beginning amount, and then you would add corrections. Ano ba yung corrections? Ito yon, yung previous topic natin, yung prior period errors. So, as mentioned kanina, there are mga items or prior period errors na mag-i-increase ng retained earnings, merong magdi-decrease. So, dito yun magre-reflect sa statement na to. If mag-i-increase siya, you would add it kasama ng net income. So as said kanina din sa first few slides, income summary is close to retained earnings. And dito yon din mare-reflect. So 'di ba nga sa sole proprietorship, yung income summary is dediretso na lang sa owner, capital na account. Dediretso na siya doon lahat. Tapos sa partnership naman, yung net income is paghahati-hatian ng partners, tapos dediretso sa kanya-kanya nilang capital account. Sa corporation, yung net income is pupunta na agad sa retained earnings. For the purpose nga na wala namang definite na names of owners si corporation kasi pwedeng mag-iba-iba yung owners niya depending kung nakanino na yung shares at the reporting date. And then less corrections, again, merong mga prior period errors na magpapababa ng retained earnings. Next is dividends. So yung mga dividends earlier, lahat sila merong debit retained earnings. Dito din yun magre-reflect sa statement na to. And then appropriations. So kumbaga, yung amount na nandito, tinransfer mo to appropriated. So mababawasan si unappropriated. That would yield us to unappropriated retained earnings na ending. So when we have these two amounts, yung appropriated and unappropriated, we can sum them up to arrive at the total retained earnings. So ayun lang naman siya. Wala namang masyadong accounting problems with this one. Mostly with regards to journal entry, and if kailangan, you may try then preparing the statement of retained earnings. And then next, we have the statement of changes in shareholders' equity. So this is the counterpart of changes in owner's equity and changes in partner's equity in corporations. As na daanan nyo na dun sa sole proprietorship and maybe sa partnership, meron din silang statement of changes in equity, di ba? But different yung structure nila. Yung sa owners kasi simple lang na changes talaga. Yung beginning, tas net income, tas withdrawals, tas ending na agad. Then sa partners, ganun lang din, but naparami yung columns kasi there are multiple owners. But in here, we have the statement of changes in shareholders' equity. And for me, ito yung pinaka-komplikado sa tatlo, sa owners, sa partners, pati sa shareholders. Ito yung pinaka-mahirap gawin and pinaka-madaming elements. Kasi it shows all movements in shareholders' equity. Hindi siya naka-classify per account or per owner, but rather per element ng shareholder. So merong separate column for ordinary shares, may column for preference shares, may column for share premium, for dividends, for treasury shares. Lahat ng elements ng shareholders' equity nakalagay dito sa financial statement na to. So inclusions nga, there would be also an entry to reflect the total comprehensive income for the period. Again, yung total comprehensive income is profit or loss plus OCI, other comprehensive income. So that would entail a change naman talaga in shareholders' equity. And then effects of changes in policies and correction of errors. As yun nga, discussed earlier, kapag may prior period errors o kaya may policies na nabago, retained earnings would be changed. So the shareholders' equity would also be changed. Kasi part lang ni shareholders' equity si retained earnings. And then yung na-mention ko kanina, reconciliation between beginning and ending balances. So for example, meron kang ordinary share capital at the beginning na 1 million pesos, tas end of the year, 2 million pesos na siya. Kailangan mong ipakita yung plus and minus na ginawa mo para mag-arrive sa 2 million in this financial statement. So imagine, one column lang yun for ordinary, and then another for preference, for share premium, for treasury, for retained earnings. So marami talaga siyang gagawin dito. And one example that I grabbed from the internet is this one. So this is a statement of changes in equity example from Welton Limited. So as you can see, tagi-isang tagi-isang column per element ng shareholders equity. We have preference shares, common shares, contributed surplus or share premium, retained earnings, accumulated other comprehensive income, which is yung ayun nga yung OCI, and then yung total nila. So dito preference shares, ayun, wala daw nagbago, so same pa rin. But in here, common shares, 500,000 siya on January 1. Tapos, ang balance niya December 31, 600,000. Kailangan siyang i-reflect dito sa statement na to. So, to trace back, bakit nga ba daw tumaas, pwede niyong tignan yung column, merong 100,000 na nalagdag. And from which financial event? Nag-issue daw, nag-issue ng common shares. So, nadagdagan, kaya naging 600,000. So yung share premium wala ding change. Si retained earnings, ayan, merong cumulative effect on prior years. So merong changes in policy. So ito, an example of change in policy is, for example, gumagamit ng FIFO inventory costing method si company. Tapos ginawa niyang weighted average. So magkakaroon niya ng changes sa amounts ni inventory. Kaya mababago si retained earnings. And then ito, a prior period error na overstated daw. Overstated si net income, overstated si inventory. So kapag overstated asset, binabawasan. So kaya deduct 20,000 retained earnings. So ayan. And then you could also add sa retained earnings yung net income, OCI, and then yun, nagbawas din siya ng 50,000 for dividends declared. So ayun yung statement of changes in equity. The problem that would lie on here is hindi masyadong word problems but with regards to its preparation. So if ever man ipapaprepare kayo ng statement of changes in shareholders equity, just follow na lang din the guides that na ni-recommend sa inyo since example lang to. So baka merong mga required columns, required changes, yung formats, ganun. But ang important dyan is mapakita yung gitna. It's not really yung dulo pati yung taas, but rather yung pinakamalaman na content dyan is gitna. How did you arrive to your ending balances? So ayun. Next, our second to the last topic, we have book value per share. So what is book value per share? It is the amount paid on each share if the corporation is liquidated. So what do we mean by liquidated? Kapag liquidated, ito na yung corporation is magsasara na or it would be going out of business. So kapag naman mag-liquidate si corporation, syempre, kailangan niyang ibalik lahat ng mga resources na na-collect niya sa mga shareholders niya. Kasi mag-close out na nga siya. So ang aim niya is i-zero out lahat ng accounts, assets, liabilities, equity, dapat zero. And to close out equity accounts, ibabalik niya yun lahat sa shareholders. So, book value per share is magkano per share yung maibabalik sa shareholders. So, similar to cash dividends, meron din siyang two methods of computation. So, kapag one class, ordinary only, again, madali lang siya. So yung total shareholders equity, i-divide mo lang siya by the number of outstanding shares. So total shareholders equity, again, kasama dyan, share capital, share premium, retained earnings, deduct yung treasury shares. So yun yung mga components, di ba, ng total shareholders equity. I-divide mo siya sa number of outstanding shares. So paghahati-hatian nila lahat ng shareholders equity na natira. Yun yung for ordinary only. But if merong preference shares, we have two situations pa. Merong stated liquidation value and then yung isa no stated liquidation value. But first, ano ba muna yung liquidation value? It is the cash price and other considerations that can be received in a forced sale of assets in liquidation. So kapag kasi nagli-liquidate, 'di ba kailangan ng mabenta na lahat ng assets. There would be an estimate na kapag binenta ko ba lahat ng resources na to, magkano yung ma-receive ng corporation. So that is the liquidation value. And the liquidation value is most likely dedicated for the preference shares kasi preferred. So kapag meron tayong liquidation value, ang book value ng preference share would be liquidation value plus preference shares dividends if any. So that includes arrears tsaka current year. Kapag arrears, kapag cumulative yung preference shares, you would recognize again arrears. Kapag non-cumulative, current year lang yung part na to. And then number of outstanding preference shares. Then, you would now compute the book value for ordinary shares. So, take note lang na kahit dito sa book value, similar din sa dividends, una nyo palaging compute si preference shares para hindi kayo malito. And then last na always, si ordinary shares. Ang computation for ordinary shares, total shareholders equity minus share capital na preferred, that would include share capital preference and share premium preference. Dalawa siya minus dividends again yung preference if any, arrears or current man yan if anong applicable, divided by the number of outstanding ordinary shares. So basically yung concept lang naman ng formula na to, we would dedicate the liquidation value for preference plus yung dividends na entitled sila. Yun yung paghahati-hatian nila during liquidation. And then kay ordinary is kung ano na lang matira. Yung total na shareholders equity, ibabawas na doon yung kay preference na share capital, ibabawas na rin yung dividends. Yung natira, yun yung paghahati-hatian ng outstanding ordinary shares. Yun is kapag merong stated liquidation value. Pero kapag hindi naman sinabi yung liquidation value, i-replace nyo lang actually yung numerator ng preference shares. It would be PS share capital na, same na sila. Share capital ng preference plus dividends if any divided by number of outstanding preference shares. And then sa ordinary, same formula pa rin, total shareholders minus preferred share capital minus preferred dividends divided by outstanding OS. So to recap, total divided by outstanding, ganun lang siya kasimple. But there can be some tweaks or changes sa formula, lalo na kapag liquidation, tas may dividends, ganun. So liquidation plus dividends, kapag may liquidation, share capital plus dividends if walang liquidation. So example problem. Backburner company has the following components of shareholders equity. Meron daw siyang ordinary shares na 10,000 outstanding at 5 pesos par, 50,000 in total. Share premium 25,000, retained earnings 120,000. To give us a total of shareholders equity na 195,000. So as we can observe naman sa shareholders equity niya, one class of share lang. So the formula that we would use is this one, yung mas simple. So total shareholders equity na 195,000 divided by number of outstanding shares na 10,000. This one, we would arrive at book value per share na 19.50 pesos. So if you're an ordinary shareholder of Backburner Company, you would expect na makakatanggap ka ng 19.50 pesos every share na hawak. So ganun siya. Yung denominator, take note lang, it is not the share capital na 50,000 but rather number of shares na 10,000. Kasi nga ang hinahanap is per share, hindi naman yung amount siya. So book value per share, total divided by shares. Now, an example problem for two classes. Ayan, nawala na naman siya on my end. Ayan. A corporation has the following components of shareholders equity. Mas mahaba na siya. Cumulative preference shares, 4%, 8,000 outstanding, 20 pesos par, at a total of 160,000 pesos. Share premium preference 240, ordinary shares 22,000 outstanding, 12 pesos par at 264. Share premium ordinary at 188, retained earnings at 365 to give us a total of 1,217,000 pesos. The conditions are this one. The corporation is being liquidated, having its preference shares liquidation value at 50,000 pesos. Due to financial insufficiencies, it has not issued dividends for 3 years. How much is the book value per preference and ordinary share? So to compute this, we need to determine muna kung anong situation ba yung pinagagalawan natin. Is the liquidation value stated or not? So in this case, stated naman siya. Liquidation value at 50,000 pesos. So we would use this formula, itong dalawa. So first of all, ang i-compute nga muna again is book value per preference. So book value per preference, liquidation plus dividends if any, divided by number of outstanding preference shares. Liquidation value is this one, 50,000. Preference dividends. Now, paano nga ba natin i-determine yung dividends? Depende sa type ni preference share. In this case, cumulative siya. So we would also recognize yung dividends na hindi na-issue from the past. Or in other words, yung dividend in arrears. So there are 3 years nga daw. It has not issued dividends for 3 years. So that would give us 160,000 na share capital na preference times dividend rate na 4%. That would give us 6,400. Pero yun nga, sabi, 3 years. So 6,400 times 3 years mo pa. So kaya siya may times 3 years dito. Divided by number of shares ni preference. So 8,000. Be careful lang din kasi there might be times na ma-confuse. Tapos ito yung nagamit. Kapag book value per preference, preference na gagamitin. So 50,000 plus 160 times 4% times 3 divided by 8,000. That would give us book value per preference share na 8.65. The next step, compute na naman yung book value for ordinary shares. Total shareholders equity minus share capital ni preferred shares minus preference dividends divided by outstanding OS. So, to share lang din, dito ko medyo nalito dati kasi etong part na to na PS share capital, I always thought na liquidation value yung gagamitin. But it's always ito. Same lang siya. Kahit may liquidation value or wala, it's always the PS share capital na dinededuct sa total shareholders equity. So, yon. So 1.217 million na total. It's this one. Then PS share capital. So 160 and 240. Bakit dalawa? Kasi merong share capital at par. Meron ding premium. 160 and 240 siya. So yun yung PS share capital. Minus PS dividends if any. Pwede nyo na lang i-copy yung part na to since same lang naman yan. 160 times 4% times 3 years. But this time minus siya. Minus yung share capital minus din dividends divided by outstanding OS na 22,000. So that would yield us book value na 36.26 pesos. So if you can observe, hindi naman ibig sabihin na preferred ka, mataas agad yung ibibigay sa'yo. There are still times na malaki pa rin yung natira, kaya malaki pa rin yung mabibigay kay ordinary. So ayun, kay ordinary shareholders daw ni backburner, ni corporation pala, hindi na pala ni backburner. Yung ordinary daw would receive 36.26 each. Tapos yung preferred, 8 pesos lang. So it depends talaga sa situation ni company kung sino yung mabibigyan ng mas marami. And you can also remember din sa dividends, there are times na yung natirang excess kapag non-participating si preference, sobrang laki ng excess, lahat yun mapupunta kay ordinary dahil lang sa type ni preference share na hindi daw siya sasali. So, yun. Hindi naman ibig sabihin always na preference is always good. So, there are also times na si ordinary may benefits din siya. So, yun. Yung book value per share. So, hindi ko pala siya nalagyan ng problem. So, let us now move on sa earnings per share, which is our last topic. So, earnings per share, madali lang naman siya. Net income earned by each ordinary share. This is reported on the income statement. Sa income statement, di ba, you have income expenses. And then, siguro sa pinakababa nun, nakalagay dapat after ni net income, earnings per share, ire-report din siya. So, ang formula niya is EPS equals net income minus preference share dividends divided by number of ordinary shares. So, himayin natin, net income, ito nga yung makikita sa ending ng income statement. And then, bakit ibabawas si preferred dividends? Kasi, yung preferred dividends, hindi siya, ang kino-compute kasi natin dito is income per share, per ordinary share. So kapag sinama natin si preferred dividends, hindi siya tama kasi hindi naman yun mapupunta sa ordinary shareholders. So we need to deduct from the net income yung preferred dividends kasi hindi siya part ni ordinary. Hindi siya, ah, parang pera siya na dedicated lang sa preference, hindi siya earnings ni ordinary. So divided by number of ordinary shares. So yun, since simple lang siya, let us have our last set of problems with JPN points again with regards to this one. So kindly remember the formula, madali lang naman. Income minus dividends divided by ordinary shares. JPIA Corporation has reported net income 1,500,000 for the year ended 2023. If its preference shareholders are entitled to receive 250,000 in dividends and it has 20,000 ordinary shares, what is the earnings per share? So let us come back ng 5 minutes, 11:31. And then if meron na din namang sagot, you can also chat me in private message sa Teams or raise your hand. Thank you. Ayan, so nakapag-send na si Roger sa akin but we will be waiting lang din for the other attendees. Baka meron silang uh, sagot. Sagot na kayo guys kasi 5 JPN points din to ang sayang. Any answer would be awarded din naman for trying. Ayan. So, it's already 11:31. So, meron pa bang want
Wait,
maghabol ng sagot?
hindi daw po mag-loop.
Okay. So, ayun. Si
Wait,
Roger yung may
wait,
answer. Wait lang.
wait lang daw.
Sige, sige. Wait lang. So,
Six,
again, ayun. Anong answer,
62,
answer?
62.5 din daw po sagot ni, wait lang po, ni ano po, ni Miss Erica saka ni Miss Abigail.
Okay, okay. So, goods, goods. So, let us check the answer na. So, yes, 62.5 yung earnings per share natin. So, again, 1,500,000 na net income minus 250,000 dividends for preference divided by ordinary shares na 20,000, 62.5. So, since nag-attend naman kayo, feel ko you all deserve naman JPN points. So, lagayan ko na din kayo, guys. Okay. So,
Nagpa-shoutout daw po sila kasi hindi daw po ma-send.
Okay, okay. Oo nga, walang chats. So, ayun. Thank you very much for everyone for attending this meeting. So, I really appreciate your presence dito sa peer mentoring session. And we wish you luck sa upcoming midterms nyo if kailan man yan gawin. And ayun, good luck sa partnership and corpo journeys nyo. And if may questions kayo, message lang kayo sa amin, kay Kuya Francis or sa akin. And ayun, we'll try to help din naman. Thank you.
Thank you po. At least
Thank you,
may progress
Roger.
po compared po nung first.
Ayun, may progress. Yes.
Yes
Thank
po,
you, thank you.